Hi guys! Tonight let's drift back through the centuries to unravel why breakfast, the meal we can't imagine skipping today, was almost unheard of in the Middle Ages. You might be surprised to learn that most people simply didn't eat in the morning, and it wasn't because they weren't hungry. In fact, the reason lies deep in medieval beliefs, daily routines, and even the church itself. So let's begin our slow walk through winding village lanes, castle kitchens, and humble peasant huts to discover the quiet world of mornings before breakfast ever existed. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. In the heart of a medieval village, before the first rays of dawn touched the thatched rooftops, the world was silent except for the soft sounds of animals stirring and fires being rekindled in the darkness. There were no bustling kitchens, no clatter of pans, and no inviting smell of coffee or frying bread drifting through open windows. Most people would rise with the sun, or even before it, but their first thoughts were not of food. Instead, the day began with quiet rituals, a whispered prayer, a gentle splash of cold water, or the slow tying of shoes made from rough leather. The village itself felt half asleep, waiting for the warmth and light to wake it fully. In the Middle Ages, eating early was often frowned upon, not just by custom, but by the strict teachings of the church. To eat before morning prayers was seen as a sign of gluttony, a weakness of character that everyone was warned against. Breakfast, or breaking the fast, was literally what the word implies, the first meal after a long night without eating. But most people delayed it for hours, sometimes until midday. For peasants, whose lives revolved around the fields, this was partly practical. They woke before dawn, heading straight out to work, hoeing, sowing, or tending animals on an empty stomach. Food was precious, and the idea was to save it for when it was truly needed, after the hardest labor was done. For the lords and ladies in the manors or castles, the rules were even more strict. The day would begin with church, sometimes a private prayer, sometimes a chapel service with all the household present. Only afterward, much later, would any food be served, and even then, it was rarely called breakfast. The church's influence was everywhere. Monks and nuns, who were the strictest followers of religious rules, often fasted for long hours, only eating when the sun was well up. Medieval doctors, following ancient texts, even argued that eating too early was unhealthy. It could disturb the body's humors and bring on sickness. This belief seeped into every layer of society, reinforcing the custom of waiting. Yet, despite the rules, there were quiet exceptions. Children and the sick might be given a bit of bread in the morning, or perhaps some weak ale to keep up their strength. But these were not considered real meals, just little mercies allowed by the church. For most adults, the first taste of bread or cheese, maybe a sip of ale or watered wine, wouldn't come until many hours after sunrise. And so, the morning in a medieval village unfolded slowly, with empty stomachs and quiet patience, everyone waiting together for that first, simple meal. From the quiet chill of morning, as sunlight stretched across muddy streets and dew clung to the wild grass, villagers fell into their routines with little thought of food. The rhythm of the day was set by necessity, not desire. There was water to fetch, animals to tend, and fields to inspect before the true work began. No one rushed, for haste was as foreign to them as a hot breakfast. Sometimes a weary farmer might pause to lean on his wooden staff and watch his neighbors begin their tasks. The air was filled with the soft braying of donkeys, the gentle bleating of sheep, and the distant crow of a rooster who had long since become the unofficial village alarm clock. Yet in all this, the village ovens and hearths remained cold. The idea of heating precious wood or peat just for a morning meal would have seemed wasteful, even selfish, to most. Bread was baked only once every few days, and what little was left needed to last. The same loaf that was broken for the evening meal might be gnawed again at midday, toughened by the air and made more edible by soaking it in ale or thin soup. Breakfast, as we know it, a meal to start the day, a comfort and a pleasure, did not exist in the minds of most medieval people. Instead, there was noon meat, or dinner, which might not come until several hours after sunrise. Some scholars and chroniclers of the time remarked on this peculiarity, noting how foreign travelers were often startled to find that their English or French hosts did not offer a meal upon rising. Even the upper classes, who had more resources and could afford greater luxuries, rarely made exceptions. In the castle's great hall, the first meal would be served only after the day's first work was done. Lords might review their estates, hear petitions from villagers, or settle disputes before anyone even thought of eating. Ladies might spend the early hours spinning, sewing, or overseeing the work of servants, their thoughts far from the kitchen. For monks and nuns, the day's rhythm was even stricter. Rising in the darkness for matins, night prayers, they might not taste a single crumb until the bell rang for the next set of prayers, hours later. This daily discipline was both spiritual and physical, a test of patience and humility. To eat too soon, or too much, was considered a failure of self-control. The Church taught that the stomach was a source of sin. Feed it too often, and you risked becoming greedy, lazy, or distracted from your duties to God. This teaching trickled down into every household, shaping the very structure of medieval life. The lack of breakfast was not merely an economic reality, but a social expectation, one reinforced by centuries of belief and routine. Yet, beneath the surface, people found small ways to bend the rules. A mother might quietly slip her child a bit of yesterday's bread, softened in warm water if the morning was especially cold. An old shepherd, setting out before the sun, might tuck a small hunk of cheese into his pocket to nibble when no one was watching. These secret snacks were never called breakfast and rarely spoken of. They were practical responses to hunger, not true meals. And so each day began not with the joy of eating, but with the discipline of waiting, the comfort of ritual, and the slow, patient work that would eventually make that first bite all the sweeter. As the hours passed, the village slowly awoke in earnest, but the air of patience and restraint lingered. Workers moved steadily, their bodies already warmed by physical labor rather than by food. The smith struck his iron with deliberate care, each blow echoing in the morning air. The baker swept out the cooling oven, his mind more on the dough for the next batch than on any personal hunger. In the meadows, women and children knelt together, plucking herbs and wild greens for later, chatting in soft voices that blended with bird song. No one complained about the absence of breakfast, for it was simply the way of things. Hunger in those early hours was a quiet companion, never overwhelming but always present, a gentle reminder of the value of self-control. Medieval people understood that food was too precious to be squandered thoughtlessly, especially at the start of the day when so much work still lay ahead. The morning routine wove together necessity and tradition. For those in the countryside, animals needed care before humans could even think of themselves. Cows had to be milked, goats led to pasture, chickens released from their coops. Only when these tasks were finished would a family pause, often gathering for a brief prayer or moment of stillness, their stomachs still empty. In towns and cities, too, the rhythm was similar. Artisans unlocked their shops, apprentices swept dusty floors, and the air filled with the distant sounds of industry and life. The expectation remained. Only after a good portion of the day's work was complete would it be proper to break the night's fast. Even among the wealthier classes, the discipline held strong. In great stone halls, the day's business came first. Messengers arrived with news, scribes recorded inventories, and servants rushed about in silence, all on empty stomachs. The absence of breakfast was a sign of order and dignity, not neglect. It showed that a household placed duty and piety above personal pleasure. For the deeply religious, the rules were even more strict. Throughout Europe, monasteries dotted the countryside, each governed by the unyielding schedule of the canonical hours. Monks and nuns rose in darkness, prayed together in echoing chapels, and set about their daily chores, each moment infused with meaning and self-denial. The fast was not just physical, but spiritual, a reminder to keep the body in check so the mind and soul could focus on higher things. The Church's warnings about gluttony and the dangers of indulgence colored every aspect of life. Gluttony was seen not just as a sin, but as a kind of moral failing that could bring shame upon a family or community. To eat when it was not necessary, to give in to hunger's first whisper, was to admit weakness. And so people learned to ignore their rumbling stomachs and push through the morning with determination. Yet, as the sun rose higher and the world grew brighter, tiny acts of kindness and practicality sometimes slipped through the cracks of strict routine. A tired grandmother might offer her grandchild a sip of weak beer or a bite of honeyed bread, just enough to take the edge off their hunger. A mason scaling scaffolding on a church tower might munch a dried fig hidden in his pouch, careful not to draw the attention of his fellows. These moments were never celebrated or discussed openly, but they provided quiet comfort in a world that prized restraint above all else. In this way, the morning hours of medieval life were shaped by patience, discipline, and the steady march of time, a communal waiting that bound everyone together in a gentle hunger as the day slowly unfolded toward its first true meal. As morning stretched on, time seemed to move at its own gentle pace in the medieval world, unhurried by the rush that would one day define modern life. The bell towers marked the passing of hours with a solemn echo, and each chime served as both a reminder of the day's obligations and a measure of how much longer the wait for food would last. Around mid-morning, hands grew calloused, and muscles tired from steady effort, but rarely did anyone pause to express discomfort. For many, hunger was simply a part of living, woven into the daily rhythm, much like the songs sung in the fields or the stories whispered by the hearth at night. The absence of breakfast fostered a kind of communal patience, an understanding that the reward of a meal would be all the more satisfying when earned after honest toil. Children, of course, felt the weight more keenly than adults. Their young faces would light up at the thought of even the simplest treat, a heel of bread, an apple saved from autumn, or a sip of warm goat's milk. Sometimes a mother, noticing the faint complaint in her child's eyes, would quietly share a secret mouthful of food, her gesture as much an act of love as of rebellion against custom. But even these small kindnesses did not disrupt the larger order of things. In most homes, the main meal of the day, dinner, remained the central focus, anticipated like a festival no matter how humble its offerings. The anticipation gave each bite an extra sweetness, every crumb a sense of gratitude. By the time the sun stood high, the whole village would come alive in new ways. Fields buzzed with activity as more hands joined the labor. In towns, markets bustled with buyers and sellers exchanging greetings and goods. The smells of bread baking or stew simmering sometimes drifted through open windows, but these aromas were teases, reserved for later. The real feast would come when the day's first work was complete, and only then would the rules permit everyone to gather and share. The medieval aversion to breakfast was so deeply rooted that even visiting travelers would adapt, often writing home in amazement at this strange local custom. Priests and chroniclers described it in sermons and letters, noting both the piety and the practicality behind it. Over time, what had started as a blend of religious caution and economic necessity grew into an unspoken law, part of the very fabric of daily life. Yet hunger, like water, always finds a path. On especially cold mornings or during the leanest months, a kind neighbor might offer a bite of soft cheese or a mug of watered wine before the official mealtime. Such gestures were never counted as real meals and were easily forgiven, especially when offered to the very young, the elderly, or those weakened by illness. Still, the discipline of waiting continued to shape every morning, setting a tone of endurance and quiet strength. Meals, when they finally arrived, felt sacred, an earned joy rather than a daily rite. This was the world of the Middle Ages, a place where patience and routine shaped not only how people lived, but how they experienced hunger, work, and the satisfaction of a meal shared in the company of others. Across the countryside, this daily pattern unfolded almost unchanged, year after year, from one season to the next. In spring, when the days lengthened and the work of sowing began, mornings were brisk, damp, and filled with hope for the harvest to come. Villagers greeted the dawn wrapped in woolen cloaks, breath clouding in the chill, their bellies as empty as the furrowed fields they tended. The fast of the morning was felt most strongly then, yet no one broke with tradition. Through the summer, the fields grew thick with life, and chores multiplied. Sunlight poured into open doorways and warmed the stone floors, yet still, the first meal was held at bay until the sun had climbed high. The custom was more than stubbornness. It was a collective rhythm that gave structure to the chaos of rural life. Autumn brought its own trials and blessings. Harvest time was a frenzy of movement, scythes swinging, sheaves gathered, wagons groaning beneath their weight. The scent of ripe grain and fresh earth filled the air, but the rules did not change. Only after the morning sweat and toil would the villagers gather for a simple, hearty meal: coarse bread, beans, or a stew thickened with roots and greens. Even during these busiest times, the discipline held firm, uniting everyone in shared anticipation. Winter, with its icy winds and long, dark mornings, was the harshest test of all. The fire's warmth was jealously guarded, and the larder grew thin as the weeks dragged on. Hunger pressed in, not just as a spiritual trial, but as a real, physical presence. It was then that quiet exceptions were made, just enough to keep the weakest from failing. But still, even as a mother stirred porridge for a sick child, or a father slipped a crust to a shivering farmhand, these small acts of kindness never grew into a daily breakfast for all. Instead, the people of the Middle Ages clung to their rituals, finding comfort in the familiar routine of waiting. Their patience was both necessity and virtue, a discipline that shaped not only their mornings, but their whole approach to life. In manors and castles, the story was much the same, though the surroundings were grander. Lords and ladies rose early, their days dictated by duty, prayer, and responsibility. The absence of breakfast was a mark of refinement and self-mastery, a sign that one's appetites did not rule over one's actions. Guests, too, were expected to adapt. To offer food, upon rising, might be seen as crude or indulgent, an insult rather than a kindness. Meals were reserved for their appointed time, and until then, conversation, music, or quiet reflection filled the morning hours. Even feasts and celebrations began only after the first work and prayers were done. Through all these layers of society, from the humblest field hand to the highest noble, the morning fast was a thread that connected everyone. It wove a sense of shared experience, a reminder that hunger was not shameful, but honorable, a small price to pay for discipline, faith, and the hope of a satisfying meal to come. In this world, the very idea of breakfast as a daily ritual would have seemed almost strange. Food was intimately tied to labor and the passing of time, not to comfort or convenience. The medieval mind viewed eating in the morning with suspicion, as if it might invite sloth or dull the senses needed for the work ahead. Parents taught their children the value of waiting, explaining that patience built character, and that a meal earned after honest effort was far sweeter than one taken in idleness. Stories told by the fireside reinforced this lesson, tales of saints who fasted, of wise kings who ruled with restraint, and of common folk who endured hardship with quiet pride. Even the language reflected these values. To break the fast was a phrase reserved for the meal that followed true labor, not for a hasty bite before the day's work had begun. In bustling market towns, the pattern held true. Merchants opened their stalls in the early light, their carts filled with bread, cheese, apples, and salted fish. Yet few would taste their own wares until the bell tolled for the main meal. Bakers and brewers sometimes worked through the night, but their first reward was not food, but the satisfaction of a job done well. Inns and taverns, which might later fill with laughter and music, stood quiet in the dawn. Travelers seeking refreshment in the early hours were met with polite refusals or offered nothing more than a mug of watered wine or thin ale, perhaps with a scrap of yesterday's bread. It was simply not the custom to serve a true meal at daybreak. Over time, these habits became second nature, a part of the unspoken rules that governed medieval life. People learned to ignore the first pangs of hunger, channeling their energy into tasks that brought value to their families and communities. This daily endurance was not just a matter of scarcity, it was an ethic, reinforced by religious teachings and social norms. For the very poor, this discipline was sometimes a harsh necessity. The morning might bring only the hope of food later in the day, and families would find strength in the rituals that distracted from hunger. Prayer, work, a shared song, or the small comforts of routine. Even so, the act of gathering for a meal, no matter how late, became a celebration of survival, a moment when hunger gave way to gratitude and togetherness. As the seasons turned and years slipped by, the custom endured, shaping not just what people ate, but how they understood time, patience, and the meaning of a good life. Breakfast for them was not simply a meal denied. It was a lesson in restraint, a shared pause that made every bite, when it finally came, a little more precious. While the rules of the morning fast shaped daily routines, they also influenced the broader culture of hospitality and sharing. Visitors arriving at a home in the early hours were usually welcomed with warm words and perhaps a seat by the fire, but seldom with food. To offer a meal at sunrise would be to break with custom, even to risk being seen as lacking in piety or self-control. Instead, hosts and guests exchanged news, discussed the weather or matters of trade, and waited together for the time when it was proper to eat. In monasteries, this discipline was even more pronounced. Guests and travelers who found shelter in the abbey's guest house were expected to respect the monastic hours. Meals were served according to a strict schedule, always after prayers and never in the quiet hush of dawn. Monks and nuns, moving silently through stone corridors, gave the impression that patience and restraint were as vital to the soul as bread was to the body. The influence of the church extended beyond its walls. Sermons delivered in village churches reminded everyone of the spiritual value of fasting, especially in the morning. Preachers warned against the dangers of indulgence and reminded their flock that Christ himself endured long hours without food. For centuries, these teachings set the tone for daily life, reinforcing the belief that self-denial brought one closer to holiness and community. As a result, even when a neighbor showed up hungry or a traveler appeared at the gate, charity was expressed in careful ways. A slice of bread might be shared, or a cup of weak ale offered, but the main meal was never brought out early except in cases of true need. This cautious generosity became another thread in the social fabric, a way of caring for others without undermining the virtue of patience. The very structure of the medieval day was built around these habits. Bells rang out across the countryside, dividing the hours into periods of labor, rest, and prayer. The sound was a constant presence, reminding everyone that there was a right time for every activity, including eating. This measured approach helped people endure hardship, giving rhythm and predictability to a world often ruled by uncertainty and chance. The kitchen itself was a place of waiting and careful planning. Fires were lit only when needed, and food was measured out with an eye to the days ahead. Bread, cheese, and ale were staples, but they were not to be wasted. Even when pantries were full after a successful harvest, the custom held strong. Every family knew that lean months could return without warning, and so the morning restraint became a safeguard against future scarcity. Over time, the absence of breakfast shaped not just individual lives, but whole communities. It became a mark of discipline, a quiet agreement that everyone, rich or poor, strong or weak, would start the day with patience. In this way, the simple act of waiting for the first meal of the day became a small but powerful source of unity, a reminder that some customs, though shaped by hardship, could bring people together in the slow, steady rhythm of life. Though the landscape of medieval life was shaped by scarcity and custom, mornings were not without their moments of gentle humanity and small joys. In villages, the early hours might see neighbors nodding a silent greeting as they set about their chores, the stillness broken only by the rhythmic clatter of buckets at the well or the distant bleating of sheep. Children, often the first to rise, would scamper barefoot through dewy grass, their laughter soft and fleeting in the dawn. Sometimes, a kindly elder might share a story or an old song to distract little ones from their hunger, weaving tales of brave knights, wise saints, or clever animals who outwitted hardship. These shared moments built bonds stronger than any morning meal, teaching young and old alike the value of patience and togetherness. The lack of breakfast, rather than dividing people, subtly encouraged them to care for one another in small but meaningful ways. The communal oven, at the center of many villages, was rarely hot in the morning. Instead, it stood as a symbol of cooperation, used later in the day to bake the bread that would sustain the whole community. When it was finally time to cook, women gathered with their dough, exchanging gossip and laughter as they prepared loaves for their families. This act of waiting, of working together before eating, fostered a sense of belonging and mutual support. In towns and cities, the same spirit could be found in the crowded streets and bustling markets. Tradespeople, craftsmen, and apprentices all knew the value of routine, and even as they worked through the morning on empty stomachs, they looked forward to the moment when bells would signal the main meal. Some city dwellers would use the early hours to catch up on news, repair goods, or tend to the sick, always mindful that real refreshment was still hours away. Yet the promise of a shared table lingered at the edge of every task, giving purpose to the work and patience to the hunger. For many, the day's first meal was as much about company as it was about sustenance. Meals were often eaten together, with families and neighbors gathered around rough tables or in the open air. The breaking of bread was both literal and symbolic, a gesture of welcome, trust, and thankfulness. In monasteries, this sense of unity was heightened by ritual. Meals were taken in silence or with readings from sacred texts, reinforcing the connection between body and spirit. The absence of breakfast then was not merely a hardship, it was an invitation to slow down, to savor the simple pleasures of companionship and the promise of nourishment. Even those who suffered the most, widows, orphans, the very poor, found comfort in the rhythms of the community, where a shared crust or a kind word could make the waiting bearable. As the sun rose higher and the world grew busier, the emptiness of the morning was gradually replaced by the fullness of hope, trust, and the quiet assurance that, in time, every table would be set and every hunger satisfied, if only one could endure the wait. As noon slowly approached and the shadows shortened, the anticipation of the first meal grew almost palpable across medieval villages and towns. The collective patience built throughout the morning would soon be rewarded, but, for now, the air was thick with the sense of earth, hay, and sometimes the faint promise of something cooking in distant kitchens. Even with hunger gnawing softly at their insides, most people moved with calm purpose, focused on finishing the tasks that separated them from their meal. Fields needed one last inspection, animals checked and penned, and tools carefully put away for the midday rest. Children, too, learned to help as best they could, fetching water, gathering firewood, or watching over the youngest siblings. The discipline of waiting for food was not lost on them, It was woven into the very fabric of their upbringing, a lesson passed from parent to child, with gentle firmness and the quiet example of elders. In manor houses, a similar energy hummed through the stone corridors. Servants hurried through their duties, polishing silver or tending to fires, all the while conscious of the ticking hours. For the nobility, meals were often more elaborate, yet the rule of waiting remained unbroken. Lords and ladies might spend the morning in meetings, overseeing estate affairs, or participating in prayers and study, each activity timed precisely to end just as the meal was ready to be served. The kitchens, usually quiet in the morning, would come alive as the appointed hour approached, with cooks stoking fires, kneading dough, and preparing stews or roasted meats. Even so, every motion was deliberate, restrained, and guided by custom rather than appetite. The careful timing of meals served a practical purpose as well as a spiritual one. Food could not be wasted, and preparing a large meal too early risked spoiling or losing the freshness so prized in bread, cheese, or meat. This habit of patience extended to the upper echelons of society and all the way down to the poorest laborers, binding the whole community together in a quiet act of endurance. Stories from the period describe this shared sense of timing, a world where the village bell, the crow of a rooster, or the warmest light of the day signaled when it was finally time to eat. There was little temptation to break the routine, for everyone understood that the satisfaction of a meal was heightened by the morning's restraint. Even the smallest morsel was appreciated more, every bowl of soup or hunk of bread taken as a small victory against hunger and a reminder of life's simple gifts. The slow build-up to the first meal of the day was not merely a matter of survival, but a way of nurturing gratitude, humility, and discipline, ensuring that each bite was cherished and never taken for granted. As the bell for the midday meal finally neared, the entire village seemed to draw in a collective breath, a subtle shift in energy as every task wound toward its natural pause. The sun had climbed high, warming fields and rooftops alike, and the sounds of labor faded, replaced by the expectation of rest and food. Men wiped sweat from their brows as they gathered tools and finished the last furrows, while women called children from their play or chores, gathering the family for the day's first proper meal. There was a sense of quiet relief in the air, an acknowledgement that after so many hours of patient waiting, the reward had finally arrived. In smaller cottages, the table might be nothing more than a rough plank of wood, but it was made sacred by the simple act of sharing. A pot of soup or porridge, a loaf of coarse bread, a wedge of cheese, and perhaps a handful of dried beans or garden herbs. These became a feast in the eyes of those who had fasted since dusk the night before. The conversation was often muted, filled with the sounds of eating and the occasional grateful sigh, as even the youngest child understood the significance of this daily ritual. For the Lord's household, the meal was more elaborate, served in courses by a line of servants and accompanied by the clink of goblets and the murmur of polite conversation. Yet beneath the formality, the same current of gratitude ran strong. Nobles and peasants alike knew the discipline of hunger, and that knowledge gave every bite a sharper sweetness. It was a time when everyone, regardless of status, paused to recognize the fragile balance between abundance and want. After the meal, the energy of the community shifted again. Bodies refueled, spirits lifted, and laughter or gentle song sometimes floated through open windows. The afternoon promised more labor, but the hardest test, the long morning of restraint, was over for another day. The absence of breakfast, so strange to modern minds, was simply woven into the cycle of medieval life: work, patience, reward. Over time, this rhythm shaped not only how people ate, but how they viewed the world. Hunger was not a sign of failure, but of self-control, and the midday meal a reminder of the strength found in waiting, in enduring, and in finally gathering to share what the earth had provided. Even as times changed and new customs slowly crept in, the old habits lingered, an echo of an era when patience and hunger walked hand in hand through every sunrise. As afternoon drifted in and the weight of hunger lifted, the village seemed to breathe easier, moving with a sense of renewed purpose. Children, now satisfied, scattered back outdoors to chase each other between hedgerows, or gather wildflowers in sunlit meadows, their laughter rising above the gentle hum of bees. Adults returned to their tasks as well, but with a lighter heart, their bellies no longer empty, and their minds at ease for a while. The hours after the meal were dedicated to more focused work: mending tools, spinning wool, tending the garden, or repairing fences battered by wind and time. The knowledge that the hardest part of the day was over brought a shared contentment. It was a quiet understanding, seldom spoken aloud, that the discipline of the morning, though sometimes difficult, had made the meal all the more precious. In towns, merchants dusted off their stalls and reopened shop fronts, eager to catch travelers or townsfolk who might have business to conduct now that everyone was fed. Apprentices worked diligently, learning their crafts beneath the watchful eyes of their masters, hands moving in practiced motions, honed by repetition and necessity. The streets filled with voices, the clatter of carts and the songs of peddlers, all energized by the ritual that had just passed. Even in great houses and castles, where comfort was more easily found, the afternoon hours held their own routines and rules. Letters might be written, accounts tallied, or lessons given in reading, music, or the intricacies of courtly manners. Noble children practiced archery or studied Latin with tutors, while adults met with estate managers to plan the next day's work. Yet everywhere, beneath the outward busyness, the memory of the morning's fast lingered, a silent bond linking rich and poor, town and country. The absence of breakfast was never resented. It was accepted as a part of life, a kind of quiet test that every soul was expected to endure. It shaped attitudes toward food and work, instilling a respect for both. Waste was unthinkable, and even the smallest portion was valued. Mealtimes became sacred pauses, moments of gratitude and connection, whether celebrated with ceremony or enjoyed in humble silence. As the day lengthened toward evening, people began to look ahead to the next small meal, usually lighter than the first, but still anticipated with gentle longing. The cycle of patience and reward, of waiting and sharing, repeated itself day after day, weaving a sense of stability and order into the unpredictable fabric of medieval existence. This tradition endured through hardship and harvest, feast and famine, forming the backbone of a culture that prized discipline above indulgence. In every village, town, and manor, the lesson of the empty morning echoed quietly. The greatest comforts are those that come to those who wait. As twilight approached and the fields took on the golden glow of the setting sun, the village's tempo slowed once again. Shadows stretched long across the land, and the air cooled, signaling to everyone that another day was quietly drawing to a close. Evening was a time for gathering together, not just to eat, but to reconnect after the labors of the day. Families returned to their cottages, where the last meal, usually modest, perhaps just a bowl of pottage or leftover bread, was shared in the soft light of a hearth or flickering candle. There was a calmness to these hours, a sense that the hardest trials were behind them, at least until the next sunrise. Conversation flowed more easily now, freed from the distraction of hunger and the urgency of work. Elders might tell stories of years gone by, or recite lessons wrapped in the language of parable. Children curled up by the fire, half listening, half dreaming, content with the closeness of loved ones. The evening meal was never grand, but it was cherished all the same. Its simplicity was a reminder that sustenance and comfort were found more in company than in abundance. Even the most ordinary foods took on a special flavor when eaten with gratitude and shared with others. For those who lived in castles or manor houses, supper might be more substantial, yet the principles were similar. The day's strict rhythms were honored. No one indulged before the proper time. Meals, whether rich or plain, marked the conclusion of a day's discipline and the beginning of rest. The absence of breakfast made these evening gatherings all the more meaningful. It taught everyone, from the youngest child to the eldest grandparent, that patience was a virtue and that even hunger could be turned into a blessing when it brought people together. As darkness deepened, the sounds of the village softened. Dogs settled beneath tables, hens roosted, and tired hands finished the last of the chores. Prayers were whispered for another day's safety and for the strength to meet the morning's fast once more. The discipline of waiting for food, so ingrained in every aspect of life, wove itself into dreams, promising that tomorrow, after a long night and another morning of endurance, the cycle of patience and reward would begin again. In this way, each day flowed seamlessly into the next, the quiet mornings of restraint giving shape and meaning to every meal, every story told, and every hour spent in the company of others. The peaceful routine of medieval evenings carried its own quiet magic, an atmosphere that seemed untouched by haste or excess. As fires crackled and the last embers glowed softly in the hearth, the people of the village took comfort in the certainty of their rituals. The day's hunger had been endured and overcome, not with bitterness, but with a sense of achievement, and now the world grew calm around them. Candlelight danced on rough walls, casting gentle shadows across the faces of families gathered close together. The absence of breakfast was rarely mentioned, yet it was always present, a silent discipline that colored every part of their existence. Parents reminded children that the morning's patience made the evening's fullness more satisfying. Even the smallest child learned, by repetition and gentle guidance, that life's sweetest joys often came after a long wait. In these moments, there was little envy of other ways of living. The old customs were so deeply embedded that most could not imagine a world where meals were taken at will, with no regard for the rhythm of day and night. The church bells tolled again, calling for evening prayers. Villagers bowed their heads in gratitude, not just for the food they had received, but for the strength to wait, to work, and to come together in peace at the day's end. Prayers flowed in quiet voices, mingling with the last songs of birds outside and the steady breath of the sleeping countryside. For monks and nuns, this time was sacred. Their day, regulated by ancient schedules, was drawing to its close. The fast of the morning and the day's silence had been endured with discipline, and the evening meal, however simple, was savored as both physical and spiritual renewal. Silence reigned in many abbeys during supper, broken only by the soft rustle of robes or the turning of a page from Scripture. Here, too, the absence of breakfast took on deeper meaning, seen as a path toward humility and a clearer connection with the divine. In towns, the nighttime routine echoed that of the countryside. Market stalls were shuttered, and the lively noise of commerce gave way to the softer sounds of home. Families tucked away their meager possessions, secured doors against the night, and found comfort in the regularity of their routines. The hardships of the day, the empty morning, the long hours of work, were softened by the promise of rest, and as they drifted into sleep, the people of the Middle Ages held within them a quiet resilience, strengthened each day by small acts of patience and the certainty that tomorrow the cycle would begin anew. The lack of breakfast was never simply about food. It was a way of living, a lesson in endurance, community, and gratitude, teaching generation after generation that the true richness of life was found not in abundance, but in the ability to wait, to hope, and to be satisfied with little when it was finally given. As the stars emerged above the quiet countryside and the world settled into gentle darkness, the discipline of the day gave way to the soft vulnerability of night. In every cottage, the fire's warmth faded slowly, its glow mirrored by the peaceful faces gathered around the hearth. The silence between family members was not empty, but filled with a deep trust that tomorrow would bring another day, much like this one. Hard but purposeful, hungry but never hopeless. The absence of breakfast, so strictly observed, had become more than just a habit. It was a source of shared identity. Children growing up in this world hardly questioned why they waited each morning. They simply accepted that patience was expected, and over time, learned to see its quiet rewards. Older folk sometimes reflected aloud on their youth, recalling harsh winters when hunger bit more fiercely, and how the lessons of restraint had carried them through even the leanest times. These memories, passed down from parent to child, were told not to frighten but to encourage. The strength to endure, they reminded each other, was the one gift that could never be taken away. In manor houses and castles, the mood was different but the lesson the same. Nobles, finished with the day's obligations, might sit by larger, brighter fires, wrapped in fine cloaks and surrounded by the comforts wealth could buy. Yet even here, the rituals of patience and self-control lingered. Courtly tales and ballads were sung, celebrating not just grand feasts, but also the virtues of moderation and restraint. Lords and ladies exchanged knowing glances, proud of their ability to wait until the appointed hour, to prove their worth through the mastery of appetite. The discipline of the morning fast was not merely tolerated, but embraced as evidence of moral superiority, a mark of dignity shared across generations. As midnight drew near, a hush settled over village and castle alike. The streets grew empty, save for the occasional flicker of a lantern as someone checked on livestock or made sure doors were bolted against the darkness. Prayers were whispered once more for safety and sustenance, and the worries of the day faded with the dying coals. The lack of breakfast, far from being a hardship, had become a thread binding the community together. It was woven into every custom, every story told, every hope for the next day's harvest. With the promise of dawn ahead, people slept soundly, confident that the patience shown today would be rewarded again tomorrow. This nightly peace was a testament to the rhythms that defined medieval life, a world where discipline, humility, and gratitude held greater value than comfort or ease, and where the gentle hunger of morning was always met, in time, by the quiet abundance of home and hearth. Before the first light crept over the horizon, the pattern began anew. Villagers stirred from sleep, stretching beneath rough woolen blankets, while distant roosters called their familiar greeting to the dawn. The fire, left to smolder overnight, was coaxed back to life with careful hands, sparks rising in the cool air, as if announcing another day's silent challenge. Once again, the entire village faced the morning's hunger together, each person privately steeling themselves for the hours ahead. There was a certain dignity in this daily struggle, a silent pact among neighbors and kin. Parents moved quietly through their cottages, tending to small chores before rousing sleepy children. The youngest often complained about their empty bellies, but a gentle shush and a reassuring touch reminded them that they would eat when the time was right. Outside, mist blanketed the meadows and gardens, hiding the world in soft gray shadows. People made their way to the fields or workshops, hands busy with the tasks that would fill the long wait until the midday meal. The first hours passed with little talk of food. Instead, focus rested on the rhythm of work and the satisfaction found in doing one's duty well. By now, the discipline of the morning fast was so deeply ingrained that even visitors to the village quickly adapted, sensing that to ask for breakfast would be out of place. Those who could not endure the wait, children, the sick, the elderly, might be quietly given a bit of bread or watered ale, a kindness offered in hushed tones and never flaunted. Yet for the rest, the hunger was both burden and badge, a reminder of belonging. In towns, the early hours saw shopkeepers and artisans setting up their stalls or tools, greeting the day with resolve rather than complaint. Monks in their abbeys moved silently to prayer, cloaked in the cool blue light that filtered through stained glass. The rules governing the absence of breakfast were followed just as faithfully here as in the countryside. Even the nobility, with their greater resources, clung to tradition, savoring the moment when patience would finally be rewarded at the proper hour. Across every class and calling, the empty morning was transformed into a period of quiet strength. It shaped not only the way people ate, but how they understood the world, reminding each person that life was a long road best traveled with humility, gratitude, and the discipline to endure a little hunger. And so, day after day, year after year, the medieval morning unfolded in its quiet majesty, a gentle test of will, an unspoken bond, and a ritual that made every shared meal a celebration of endurance and hope. With the coming of each new day, the pattern repeated, unbroken by changing seasons or shifting fortunes. The village woke to the quiet challenges of the morning fast, the landscape painted with the pale blues and pinks of dawn, and the air crisp with possibility. Every member of the community, from the smallest child to the eldest grandparent, found themselves swept up in this age-old dance of patience. There was a comfort in the predictability, a reassurance that, no matter what else changed, the ritual of waiting together would endure. As the first chores of the day unfolded, the absence of breakfast seemed less like deprivation and more like an unspoken agreement, a kind of shared discipline that required no explanation. Farmers walked their fields in silence, scanning the earth for signs of promise or threat, while shepherds led their flocks to pasture, the gentle bells on the animals echoing across the hills. The early hours belonged to the land and to duty. For women, mornings were filled with purposeful activity, hauling water, sweeping floors, kneading dough that would not be baked until much later. Children sometimes accompanied their mothers to the well or helped gather firewood, learning through imitation that work always came before reward. Even in towns, the rhythm was similar. Tradespeople opened shutters and tidied shops, apprentices set out supplies, and street vendors called their first greetings into the morning hush, all on empty stomachs. What little food might be available was set aside for those who needed it most, quietly and without fanfare. The culture of restraint reached its most visible form in monasteries and great houses. Monks and nuns, following the canonical hours, observed the morning with prayer and silence, fasting as an act of devotion. In manors, servants went about their duties under the watchful eyes of stewards, careful to respect the rules that governed the timing of meals. The nobility, though surrounded by comfort, honored the discipline of the fast as a sign of self-mastery and moral worth. It was a system that demanded much, but offered in return a profound sense of belonging. The absence of breakfast became a mark of identity, an invisible badge that signified participation in a world where hunger was not just endured, but transformed into gratitude for what would come. As the sun climbed higher, the village's energy swelled, each person drawing strength from the knowledge that the waiting would soon end. In these hours, the smallest kindness took on outsized meaning, a neighbor's friendly nod, a child's quiet endurance, a mother's gentle reassurance. These were the true fruits of the morning fast, small acts of courage and patience that bound the community together. The approach of the midday meal was felt as a gathering momentum, a promise that hardship would give way to reward, and that all the effort and waiting would soon be repaid by the simple, enduring joy of breaking bread together. As the sun rose higher and the promise of the midday meal drew near, anticipation buzzed softly in every corner of the village. Hunger sharpened the senses but dulled neither spirit nor resolve. If anything, it heightened the appreciation for all the small things. The coolness of water from the well, the cheerful sound of geese along the riverbank, the soft patter of feet across worn floorboards as families prepared for the next phase of the day. There was a special rhythm to these hours just before the meal. People became attuned to every change in the air. The scents drifting from the kitchen as fires were finally stoked, the distant ringing of the church bell, the shouts of children gathering for a last game before being called indoors. Women began to lay out simple table settings, their hands moving almost unconsciously in motions learned from generations past. Men finished the last tasks in the fields or at the forge, savoring the growing sense of relief and expectation. The communal wait for food was not a hardship to be endured in silence, but a kind of ritual in itself, one that offered a daily reminder of shared purpose and hope. In these final moments before eating, time seemed to slow. Conversations quieted, and a peaceful hush settled over households, as if everyone was listening for the signal that the wait was finally over. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing that patience would soon be rewarded, not with extravagant feasts, but with the honest fare that tasted all the sweeter for having been anticipated. Even in the largest manors and most bustling towns, the energy of the approaching meal brought everyone into subtle alignment. Cooks ladled soup into rough-hewn bowls, children helped carry bread to the table, and elders said short prayers of thanks, their words simple but sincere. The memory of the empty morning made every crumb precious. The discipline of waiting gave way to gratitude, and for a little while, the cares of the world seemed to fall away, replaced by the comfort of warm food, familiar faces, and the knowledge that tomorrow the cycle would begin again. Another morning of quiet endurance, another meal made meaningful by the gentle hunger that preceded it. Through these moments, the medieval village was held together, not just by stone walls or shared fields, but by the silent agreement to greet each day with patience, humility, and the understanding that the smallest joys are often those most dearly earned. As the meal finally arrived, it was more than just nourishment. It was the release of a tension held quietly by every soul since the first light of dawn. In humble cottages, families gathered close at low wooden tables, hands joined for a moment of silent gratitude before breaking the bread. The food was rarely abundant, but what it lacked in quantity, it made up for in meaning. A pot of barley soup simmered over the hearth, its savory aroma filling the room. Rough, crusty bread was torn and shared, each piece handled with a reverence that modern eyes might overlook. Perhaps a wedge of cheese, a handful of garden herbs, or a sprinkle of salt brightened the meal, but even the simplest fare was met with true appreciation. In these moments, the lesson of the morning fast came into focus, that patience and endurance sharpened gratitude and made every meal an event worthy of remembrance. Laughter returned to the home as hunger faded. The youngest children, their complaints replaced by contented chewing, glanced around the table, learning by example that togetherness was more valuable than abundance. The elders might share a story, recalling times of even leaner harvests or of unexpected generosity from a neighbor. The sharing of food was woven with the sharing of memories and lessons, so that the act of eating became as much about community as it was about survival. In the manor houses where resources were greater, the meal was more elaborate, yet the rhythm of anticipation and relief was the same. The dining hall filled with the clatter of knives and goblets, the soft murmur of conversation, and the laughter of those newly freed from hunger's grip. Here, the midday table might groan with roasted meats, fresh fruits, and sweet pastries, but even the most privileged maintained a veneer of restraint. To gorge was considered uncouth, moderation was a badge of honor, the morning fast a reminder to value self-control and humility, even amid luxury. In monasteries and abbeys, the meal was an act of devotion as well as sustenance. Monks and nuns ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of wooden spoons in earthen bowls or the turning of a page in a sacred book. Their discipline in waiting for this moment imbued the simplest foods, beans, onions, brown bread, with a sacredness that went far beyond taste or texture. The rule of fasting was not merely followed, but cherished as a spiritual discipline that drew the soul closer to the divine. The act of eating together, whether in silence or in song, reinforced the bonds that held the community together. After the meal, the air in the village shifted again. Bodies relaxed, chores resumed, and the laughter of children drifted outside as they tumbled into the sunshine. Bellies full, people approached the afternoon with renewed strength and focus, their patience rewarded. Yet, even as the hunger faded, the memory of the morning remained, a quiet teacher, whispering that endurance brought its own rewards, and that the simplest pleasures, when shared, were the most profound. This pattern, repeated each day, shaped not only bodies but spirits, building a foundation of gratitude and resilience, that would carry the community through both feasts and famines. The absence of breakfast was not a hardship, but a thread woven into the tapestry of life, connecting one generation to the next in an unbroken chain of hope, patience, and shared sustenance. The fullness of the midday meal marked not an end, but a turning point in the day's steady rhythm. With hunger quieted, the village shifted seamlessly into the business of afternoon, the tempo of work and conversation taking on a new, relaxed quality. Fields came alive with voices and laughter as men and women returned to the land, refreshed by food and by the company of their loved ones. Tools felt lighter in their hands. The burdens of labor, softened by the memory of morning hunger, were now borne with a gentle determination that came from knowing the hardest part was over. In homes and workshops, children and apprentices worked alongside their elders, fueled not just by sustenance, but by the reassuring certainty of daily routine. There was a sense of renewal in the air, as if the meal had poured strength and warmth into every living thing. Chores that once seemed endless, mending a fence, spinning wool, tending the fire, now flowed smoothly, each task a small part of the village's shared destiny. The discipline of the morning fast gave way to a few hours of freedom and productivity, a time when creativity blossomed and the fruits of the community's patience became visible. In towns, the afternoon was the busiest part of the day. Markets hummed with commerce. Peddlers hawked their wares from colorful carts. Neighbors exchanged news, advice, and friendly jests as they traded goods. The lingering satisfaction of the midday meal made people generous with their words and time, more inclined to pause and help or share a story. Even disputes seemed less urgent now, easily resolved over a shared mug of ale or a quiet conversation in the shade. For the noble households, afternoons were a time of order and planning. Estate managers tallied harvests and made preparations for the days ahead, while ladies gathered in solar chambers to work on tapestries, teach children, or exchange the latest tidings from neighboring lands. The structure provided by the morning fast made these hours all the more productive. Appetites sated, minds were clear and focused, unburdened by longing or distraction. In monasteries, the flow of the day was dictated by the bells, their measured tolls guiding the faithful from work to prayer and back again. After the midday meal, monks and nuns returned to their duties, whether copying manuscripts, tending gardens, or caring for the sick. The memory of the morning's discipline lingered, shaping each action with a sense of purpose and humility. Their routines, though strict, fostered a deep contentment, a peace born of order, self-denial, and the quiet joy of simple things. The absence of breakfast, far from being a hardship, was understood as a gift. It taught the value of delayed gratification, the sweetness of anticipation, and the importance of community over individual desire. It reinforced the idea that every comfort must be earned, every pleasure savored in its proper time. As afternoon light stretched across the fields and shadows grew longer, the village prepared for the evening's close. The cycle would begin again with the coming darkness, a promise that tomorrow, patience and hunger would once more shape the lives and hearts of everyone who called this medieval world their home. As the afternoon faded and the sky softened to hues of rose and gold, villagers began to gather up the day's tools, their movements unhurried and content. The fields, bustling only hours before, now stood quiet and still, their work done until the next sunrise. Children called out to one another as they returned from games and chores. their laughter ringing across the lanes and into the small stone cottages clustered at the village center. In every home, preparations for the evening's light meal began with practiced familiarity. Bread, carefully rationed throughout the day, was brought out again, and a thin pottage or stew was set to warm over the embers of the hearth. This second meal, never as generous as the midday feast, was no less treasured. It offered one last moment of comfort before the long night ahead. Families gathered in the soft, flickering light, sharing both food and the quiet company of those they loved. The conversation was gentle, unhurried, a way of unwinding the day's tensions. Children recounted their adventures, elders offered advice, and sometimes songs or prayers filled the spaces between. In manor houses, the evening routine followed a similar, if more elaborate, script. The day's labors concluded with a gathering in the great hall, where servants set out what remained of the larder's bounty. While the fare was finer and the surroundings grander, the principle remained unchanged: self-restraint, gratitude, and community. The absence of breakfast in every social class shaped the cadence of these evenings. The memory of the morning's hunger made even a small meal feel satisfying, and the discipline required to wait through the long hours became a point of pride. The shared experience of waiting bound people together across ranks and generations, creating a sense of belonging that was rarely put into words, but always felt in the warm hush of dusk. As twilight deepened into night, the village slowed to a restful stillness. The only sounds were the quiet crackle of the fire and the occasional murmur of conversation drifting from open windows. Lamps were trimmed, doors secured, and the last chores completed with careful attention to ritual. Prayers were offered for another peaceful night, and the strength to meet the coming morning's fast. In monasteries, the evening silence was absolute, broken only by the distant toll of a bell or the soft footfalls of monks in cloistered corridors. The day's discipline drew to a close in reverence and reflection, a cycle unbroken by the seasons or the passage of years. The absence of breakfast had by now become more than a rule. It was a philosophy, a quiet declaration that comfort and ease were never the highest goals. Through self-restraint and patience, the people of the Middle Ages discovered a deep well of gratitude and togetherness. As the stars wheeled overhead and the world surrendered to sleep, that silent strength sustained them, carrying every villager, noble, and monk alike toward the next day's challenges, and the enduring hope that patience, once again, would be met by fulfillment. The cycle of patience and reward, hunger and satisfaction, became the silent heartbeat of medieval life. As the moon traced its path above darkened rooftops, and the last embers in the hearth surrendered to cool ash, families drifted into sleep, their bodies and spirits fortified by the shared rituals of the day. The absence of breakfast, far from being resented, had taken on the weight of tradition, one that shaped not only daily routines, but the very character of the people themselves. It taught young and old alike the subtle arts of endurance and gratitude, lessons that echoed in every quiet morning and every humble meal. Parents gently passed these values to their children, not with lectures but by example. The father who rose at dawn to work without complaint, the mother who waited to eat so her youngest might have a little more, the neighbor who shared a crust of bread in secret with someone weaker than herself. Through these small acts, the community's spirit was strengthened, as real as the mortar that held their cottages together. Even the hardships, lean harvests, bitter winters, illnesses that spread through crowded homes, became easier to bear when faced with the knowledge that each person was not alone in their waiting. In towns and cities, too, the rhythm held sway. Merchants, apprentices, and artisans faced the same empty mornings and anticipated the same communal meals. The market squares that would later fill with lively barter and song began each day in near silence, the first echoes of life held back until the proper hour. This collective restraint gave a rare, almost magical intensity to the moment when work paused and the tables were set. The food itself, whatever it was, became an offering, not just to fill the belly, but to mark another day endured, another challenge met. For the monastic orders scattered across the countryside, the pattern held the deepest meaning of all. The absence of breakfast became a daily fast, a ritual of humility and connection to the divine. Each bite, when it finally came, was transformed by gratitude, a reminder that even the simplest pleasures were gifts to be cherished. Silence and prayer replaced chatter and haste, allowing monks and nuns to feel the hunger in their bodies as a path to spiritual clarity. In every corner of the medieval world, the story was the same. The lack of breakfast was not merely a product of scarcity or religious edict. It was a conscious daily practice that shaped hearts as surely as it shaped habits. It drew invisible threads between neighbor and neighbor, parent and child, rich and poor, weaving them into a single community bound by patience, hope, and a quiet, resilient joy. When the cock crowed and the world awoke once more, everyone knew what was expected. Each day would begin as the last had ended, with empty stomachs, busy hands, and the certainty that, together, they would wait, and together they would feast. Each new dawn in the medieval world brought with it a gentle sense of repetition, a return to the quiet challenge that had shaped so many lifetimes before. In every home, from the smallest hut to the grandest manor, the first stirring of life was marked not by the aroma of frying bread or sweet porridge, but by the rustle of clothing, the soft footfalls of early risers, and the low hum of work begun on an empty stomach. The early hours belonged to the earth and to necessity. Water needed to be fetched, fires rekindled, animals milked and led out to pasture. Across the fields, morning mist clung to hedges and furrows, lending an air of mystery to the land. Here and there a lone figure might pause for a moment, breath rising in a silver plume, before returning to the steady rhythm of labor. The absence of breakfast was not a hardship to be complained about, but a fact of existence accepted by all. There was no need for words to explain why the morning fast was observed. It was as natural as the turning of the seasons, as certain as the rising of the sun. Over time, this discipline fostered a deep and abiding resilience, giving people the strength to face each day's demands with calm and patience. Children were raised to expect the long wait for food. Their first lessons in self-control came not from books, but from the experience of enduring hunger without protest, trusting that the reward would come in due course. For many, the practice was so familiar that it hardly registered as deprivation at all. It was simply the way things were, a rite of passage that connected generations. In towns and cities, where the pace of life was faster and the demands more varied, the discipline of the morning fast took on a slightly different tone. Shopkeepers and apprentices hurried to open shutters and sweep doorways, the anticipation of commerce and community buzzing beneath the surface. Yet even here, the collective restraint held firm. The ritual of waiting united them, smoothing over differences in wealth or status. Monasteries and abbeys kept to an even stricter schedule. Here, the absence of breakfast was both spiritual exercise and practical reality, built into the very architecture of the day. Bells tolled for prayers and labor, not for eating. The morning hours unfolded in an atmosphere of silence and devotion, each task performed with careful attention and reverence. In these holy places, the simple act of waiting for food became a meditation, a way of drawing nearer to God through humility and self-denial. When the midday bell at last sounded, it was as though a collective breath was released across the land. The discipline of the morning gave way to the joy of sharing. Bread was broken, soups ladled, blessings murmured, and for a time the hunger that had bound the people together faded into a sense of peace and gratitude. The cycle would begin again tomorrow, as it always had, a quiet, enduring testament to the medieval belief that true contentment was born not from abundance, but from the patient embrace of life's simplest gifts. As days turned into weeks and seasons shifted, the morning fast became more than a habit. It was a pulse beneath the rhythm of rural and urban life alike. Every household, whether built of wattle and daub or fine stone, moved to this silent music, rising together before dawn and holding hunger in patient hands. The year's cycle only deepened this pattern. In spring, mornings were filled with hope and the promise of new growth. The chill in the air was cut by the anticipation of planting, and while hunger was a familiar companion, it was met with a kind of optimism. Parents reminded their children that seeds sown in patience would yield harvests in their own time, a lesson as true for the field as it was for the breakfastless morning. Summer brought long days of tireless work. The early light lasted, but still the rule held firm. No meal until the proper hour. The laborers bent to the fields, sweat and sun mingling on their brows, and the hours seemed endless. Yet when the midday bell rang, there was no meal more satisfying, no rest more deserved than that which followed a morning of restraint. Autumn arrived with its own gifts and hardships. The harvest meant plenty, and yet old habits remained strong. Even in abundance, the first meal was delayed, the grain threshed and stored before hands reached for bread. The joy of harvest was made sweeter by the echo of hunger, each bite a reminder of the discipline and unity that made survival possible. Winter, however, was the sternest test. The darkness lingered, and the fire's warmth was fiercely guarded. Larders grew thin, and the absence of breakfast was not just custom, but necessity. Families huddled together, drawing comfort from routine and from each other. The morning fast endured with quiet courage. These were the seasons of character, shaping the hearts of the people as surely as the weather shaped the land. The discipline of waiting gave rise to countless small acts of kindness. A neighbor, seeing a weary mother, might slip her a piece of cheese for her youngest child. An old friend, remembering leaner times, would share a secret store of apples. Such gestures never broke the unspoken code. They were understood as mercies, not meals, and so the morning fast endured, strengthened by compassion as much as by rule. Even the rare traveler, passing through a village at dawn, quickly learned to respect the rhythm. Asking for breakfast was gently refused, not out of stinginess, but out of respect for a shared tradition. In this way, the absence of breakfast became a language understood by all, a promise that each day, together, they would wait, work, and finally, be rewarded. The practice was woven into the fabric of medieval existence, coloring not just how people ate, but how they saw themselves. Patient, humble, and ever hopeful that what was withheld today would make tomorrow's bounty all the sweeter. In every corner of the medieval world, the morning fast shaped not only bodies but minds. The discipline required to greet each day with an empty stomach instilled a quiet determination, a resilience that touched all aspects of life. Children grew up understanding that their first cravings were not to be satisfied with haste, but to be acknowledged and set aside until the proper time. This simple lesson of waiting stretched into other areas of character: the patience to mend what was broken, the fortitude to see a long task through, the humility to accept hardship alongside comfort. Even the stories told in the flickering light of the hearth reflected these values. Tales of saints and heroes rarely celebrated gluttony or indulgence. Rather, they honored those who showed restraint, who fasted for a higher cause, or who waited for a blessing long delayed. The morning hunger became, in its own way, a rite of passage, a small but daily trial by which young and old alike proved their strength. In towns and cities, as trade and crafts grew more complex, the discipline of the morning continued to shape the culture. Merchants and guildsmen prided themselves on their self-mastery, trusting that the patience honed at the table would serve them well in business and negotiation. A shopkeeper who could wait for a meal could also wait for a fair price, could resist a rash bargain, could endure a slow season with hope. Apprentices learned as much from the rhythms of the day as from the tools of their trade, their endurance preparing them for the responsibilities of adulthood. Even for the wealthy, whose cellars brimmed with stores and whose kitchens bustled with servants, the old custom retained its power. It was not a lack of means, but a mark of culture and virtue, to keep the morning meal at bay until duty had been done and prayers had been said. The nobles gathered in halls, hung with tapestries, their voices measured, their appetites carefully checked. The absence of breakfast reminded them that privilege carried obligations, that to rule wisely required not only comfort, but discipline. In monasteries, this ethos was raised to the level of spiritual practice. The morning fast was a sacrament, a deliberate denial that brought monks and nuns closer to the divine. Their hunger became a prayer, a symbol of longing for something greater than earthly pleasure. The silence that accompanied the fast was filled with contemplation, their work performed as an act of worship. When the midday meal was at last served, it was received in gratitude, the simplest bread and cheese tasted as gifts. Thus, in both sacred and worldly life, the ritual of waiting for food wove itself into the medieval identity, a daily reminder that strength was not measured by what one possessed, but by what one could endure with patience, humility, and grace. Through feast and famine, through times of peace and days of unrest, the discipline of the morning fast held firm, shaping the spirit of every community. It was more than just a custom. It became a moral foundation, a way for people to prove to themselves and to each other that they possessed the endurance needed to face whatever life would bring. In the smallest villages, where news and change arrived slowly, the absence of breakfast acted as an anchor. It kept daily life tethered to something unchanging, a tradition that provided order, especially in a world where war, plague, or the sudden loss of a harvest could upend everything else. When times were hard and the larder nearly bare, the morning fast was a necessity as much as a virtue. Yet even then, people held to it not with resentment, but with a sense of dignity. They knew that by waiting together, by sharing the hardship, the hunger became lighter to bear. Small gestures took on enormous meaning, a neighbor delivering a handful of dried beans, a child giving up a treat for a younger sibling, or a group of villagers coming together to cook a communal stew. In such moments, the custom transformed from simple abstinence to a quiet act of solidarity. In the larger towns and bustling cities, where wealth and poverty existed side by side, the morning fast was one of the few shared rituals that cut across all divisions. Whether a merchant haggling in the marketplace, an apprentice sweeping the steps of a workshop, or a beggar awaiting alms near the church door, each experienced the same hunger, the same anticipation of the midday bell. Even those who had more than enough understood that discipline brought its own rewards. The temptation to break with tradition was always present, but the pull of custom and the subtle pressure of community was stronger still. Nobles and clergy, in their well-appointed halls, embraced the fast as a sign of refinement, a proof of their ability to rule themselves before ruling others. Their restraint was observed by those around them and quietly emulated, reinforcing a sense of hierarchy built not only on wealth, but on the perceived strength of character. The fast's meaning deepened further in the cloistered world of the monasteries. Here, hunger in the morning became a metaphor for spiritual longing. It was a discipline freely chosen, an act of devotion that brought monks and nuns closer together as a family of faith. The silence of the early hours was filled with the sound of pages turning, of hands working, of hearts reaching for a peace that came only with patience. When the bell finally called them to table, their gratitude was all the greater. In this way, the morning fast stood as a quiet guardian over the medieval day, a test passed by every soul, rich or poor, learned or simple. And so, each new sunrise was greeted not with complaint, but with a resolve to wait, to endure, and to trust in the promise of reward, both earthly and divine. As centuries passed, the morning fast remained woven into the fabric of life, its lessons passed from one generation to the next. The memory of empty mornings endured even as the world slowly changed. New crops were introduced, trade expanded, towns grew larger and more cosmopolitan, yet the custom persisted, its hold as much emotional as practical. To wake each day and resist the call of hunger was a way of honoring the ancestors, a silent tribute to the struggles and wisdom of those who had come before. The fast became a bridge between past and present, linking each child born in a cottage or a castle to a lineage of quiet endurance. In stories and songs, the virtue of patience was celebrated. Bards and minstrels wandered from village to village, recounting tales of wise kings who ruled with restraint, of saints who survived on little more than hope, and of lovers who endured separation with stoic hearts. The morning fast, though rarely the subject of these songs, was always there in the background, a shared experience that gave depth to the heroism of daily life. When times were good and the larders full, it was easy to keep the tradition. The memory of want made even plenty a thing to be savored slowly. When lean years returned, as they always did, the fast gave people a way to cope, to make meaning out of lack, to turn suffering into strength. In the sprawling cities, where the distance between rich and poor could seem impossibly vast, the absence of breakfast was one of the few commonalities left. It was a small, daily reminder that no matter a person's status or fortune, all were human, all were capable of waiting and hoping and enduring together. Markets might overflow with exotic spices, foreign grains and sweet fruits brought from distant lands, but the discipline of the morning remained unchanged. For the wealthy, upholding the tradition became a mark of respectability and culture. For the poor, it was often the only option. In both cases, the custom bound people to one another and to a deeper sense of belonging. Even the slow transformation of society, the rise of universities, the spread of printed books, the shifting tides of religion and politics, could not fully loosen the grip of this ancient ritual. Teachers and scholars debated the merits of various fasts. Physicians argued about the health effects of eating early or late, but in most homes the old wisdom held sway. The morning was for labor, prayer, and reflection. Food would come, but only after these things had been done. Thus, the morning fast endured as a symbol of unity and humility, a daily exercise in gratitude that transcended the boundaries of time and place. And as the medieval world moved steadily toward the changes of the future, this quiet discipline continued to shape the hearts and habits of everyone who called it home. There was a deeper poetry in the morning fast than many might realize. In the hush before the midday meal, life moved at a slower, more mindful pace. Without the distraction of breakfast, people became more attuned to their surroundings. The bird song in the hedges, the distant chime of church bells, the way light filtered through trees or window slats. The day's work was begun in a spirit of focus, each task performed with care and purpose, its value heightened by the promise of eventual reward. For a mother tending her hearth, the patience of the morning meant her bread would rise while she spun wool or mended garments. For a blacksmith, the rhythm of hammer and anvil became a meditation, hunger sharpening his attention to every glowing blade or horseshoe. Even the children learned to make play from the waiting, racing to finish their chores, or inventing games to pass the slow hours until the meal. This gentle endurance fostered a kind of inner richness, a satisfaction that came not from constant pleasure, but from the slow fulfillment of effort rewarded. The absence of breakfast shaped not only the body's appetite, but also the soul's capacity for hope and wonder. In the countryside, the fields themselves seemed to participate in the ritual, the crops growing slowly, quietly, under the care of hands that knew the value of time. The cycle of sowing, tending, harvesting, and feasting was reflected in the day's smaller cycle of fasting and eating. Both required faith, both required patience, and both offered the profound satisfaction of seeing hard work blossom into abundance. In towns, the shared hunger of the morning encouraged a spirit of camaraderie. Shopkeepers greeted each other with knowing nods. Apprentices swapped stories of past meals, and even the sternest guildmaster might be moved to a smile by the anticipation of what was to come. The absence of breakfast became a subtle form of generosity, encouraging people to be kind, to look out for one another, to share what little they had with those who needed it most. In monasteries, the fast was a sacred discipline, an invitation to humility and contemplation. The growl of an empty stomach became a reminder to pray, to seek wisdom, to set aside pride in favor of gratitude. When the bell at last signaled the meal, the food was taken in silence or song, received as a blessing rather than an entitlement. Over and over, day by day, the morning fast reinforced the medieval conviction that true happiness lay not in abundance, but in the ability to wait, to hope, and to find joy in the simplest of gifts. In this way, the discipline of an empty morning wove itself into the very meaning of life, reminding all who lived by its rules that patience was both a virtue and a quiet form of love for the world, for each other, and for the days still to come. Even as centuries rolled onward and distant lands beckoned with the promise of new discoveries, the simple practice of the morning fast remained a foundation in the changing world. The medieval dawn was timeless, and its quiet hours of restraint linked people across borders, languages, and beliefs. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims moving from one region to another quickly learned to adjust their expectations. Regardless of where they found themselves, the morning table was set with patience rather than bread. This unwritten rule acted as a silent passport, an immediate sign of understanding and respect for local ways. On the rare occasion that a foreign visitor asked for breakfast, the request was gently turned aside, perhaps with a kind smile, or a reminder that the best meal was always worth waiting for. The absence of breakfast was no longer simply a rule of necessity, but a quiet source of pride, a distinctive mark of civilization that set the medieval world apart from others. Even when change did arrive, new faiths, new rulers, new ideas, this particular custom proved remarkably resilient. In the courts of kings and in the bustling lanes of trading ports, the morning hours were still reserved for duty, prayer, and preparation. Only after these foundations had been laid was it considered fitting to gather at the table and break bread together. The discipline of the fast was not only communal but deeply personal. Many found a sense of freedom within its boundaries, a liberation from the constant chase of appetite, a trust in the body's strength to endure. It taught children to wait for good things, taught young lovers to be patient for their unions, taught workers to pace themselves and find meaning even in the longest tasks. The absence of breakfast fostered a kind of equality. Hunger made the lord and the servant, the merchant and the monk, all kin for a few quiet hours each day. Songs sung at harvest time and stories told beside winter fires often praised this patient endurance, reminding everyone that strength of heart was forged in the quiet forge of daily waiting. In cities, as towers rose higher and markets grew busier, the discipline of the empty morning took on a symbolic power. It was invoked by reformers as proof of moral fiber, by poets as an emblem of human dignity, by ordinary folk as a link to ancestors who had endured and prevailed. The morning fast became a mirror in which people saw themselves not as victims of circumstance, but as shapers of their own fate, willing to accept hardship, willing to wait, and grateful for the simplest reward. As the world outside grew more complex, as comfort slowly multiplied, the people who kept this ritual alive discovered that its true gift was not in the food denied, but in the spirit nourished by hope, unity, and the enduring belief that every day, no matter how difficult, would end in gratitude and shared abundance. With each new generation, the meaning of the morning fast deepened, becoming less about mere survival and more about the cultivation of character. Children, watching their elders go about their morning chores without complaint, absorbed the lessons of patience and quiet strength without ever needing a formal explanation. They learned early that there was dignity in restraint, and that the first hours of daylight were meant for devotion to one's family, to the land, to God or community, rather than to satisfying hunger. The rhythm of the day was so familiar that its absence would have felt unsettling, as if the world itself had lost a step. Parents passed on not only the rules of the fast, but the stories and wisdom that gave it purpose. Tales of times when food was even scarcer, or when a shared loaf of bread meant the difference between despair and hope. These stories, told in soft voices by the fire or in the golden light of evening, helped shape a worldview where gratitude was more important than indulgence, and where a meal earned after long waiting became a celebration, no matter how simple. As children grew, their understanding of the morning fast matured as well. What began as a rule enforced by parents became a practice embraced by choice, a badge of belonging, a mark of respect for the traditions that defined their world. Young adults, taking on new responsibilities in the field or workshop, found that the discipline of waiting gave them a sense of mastery over themselves and their appetites. This quiet self-control translated into other virtues: the patience to weather a harsh winter, the humility to ask for help when needed, the ability to find joy in small successes. In the bustling towns, apprentices who arrived from distant villages soon learned that the morning fast was a universal language, spoken by all who valued hard work and mutual respect. The discipline was not lost even among the privileged. Nobles and clergy took pride in showing restraint, understanding that their example shaped the attitudes of those around them. For them, the absence of breakfast was a gentle reminder of their place within the larger order, a check on pride, a call to gratitude, a daily invitation to humility. In monasteries, where the fast had always been both rule and spiritual tool, its observance bound new novices to centuries of tradition. The hunger felt in the early hours became a meditation, an opening for prayer and reflection, a means of connecting with the struggles and hopes of all those who had come before. As dusk approached and families gathered once more around their humble meals, there was a quiet recognition that the morning fast had given shape and meaning to their days, anchoring each life in a sense of shared destiny. The practice endured not only because it was necessary, but because it nurtured the very qualities that made the medieval community strong: endurance, compassion, unity, and a gratitude that could turn even the simplest meal into a feast for the soul. In the great tapestry of medieval life, the morning fast was a subtle but enduring thread, weaving through every home, every heart, every hope for the future. As the years slipped by and the world outside shifted in ways both dramatic and slow, this quiet discipline remained a constant, a foundation that anchored families and communities alike. The discipline of waiting, practiced day after day, shaped not just routines but identities. It fostered a sense of resilience, teaching young and old that comfort and satisfaction were never to be taken for granted, but earned through effort and patience. It was a lesson that transcended wealth or status, uniting noble and peasant, merchant and monk, in a shared experience that was both humbling and uplifting. The absence of breakfast did more than teach endurance. It cultivated a culture of gratitude. Each meal, when it finally arrived, was not just food for the body but a blessing recognized and received with thanks. Stories and songs from countless households echoed this gratitude, reminding all who listened that life's truest joys came not from abundance, but from the bonds of community and the strength found in shared trials. The habit of waiting shaped the very way people understood time, each morning a space for hope, each meal a reward, each hardship a chance to prove one's spirit. The discipline carried over into the way people faced life's larger uncertainties, from storms that threatened crops to wars that swept across kingdoms. The same patience learned in the dawn hours became the backbone of survival, helping people meet adversity with courage and perseverance. Over centuries, the morning fast stood as both a tradition and a quiet rebellion against indulgence. A declaration that life was richest, not in endless plenty, but in the meaning found through mindful endurance. Even as new ideas and inventions slowly crept across the land, changing diets, reshaping cities, and introducing new customs, the heart of the old ritual endured. In some places, breakfast would eventually gain a place at the table, but the memory of the fast lived on in the stories told to children and in the reverent pause before each meal. It remained, for countless souls, a cherished legacy, a sign of strength and unity, an act of faith in the promise of another day. And so, the medieval world moved forward, day by day, sunrise by sunrise, bound together by the gentle wisdom of patience, the power of hope, and the lasting gift of waiting for joy.